I am given to you by God. The words of Socrates in his defense at his trial for impiety. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. My name is Rob Paxton, and this is episode 31 of The Greek Sun, a podcast series about the history and culture of ancient Greece. Today's episode is specifically about the trial of Socrates. In the last episode in this sequence about Greek philosophy, we looked at Plato's dialogue Euthyphro, in which Socrates explains that he is standing on the porch of the Archon Basilius because he is about to be tried on charges of impiety. This episode will examine that trial and the immediate aftermath of the trial in the two Platonic dialogues known as Apology and Crito. Before we continue, however, please remember to visit my website, western-traditions.org. That's western-traditions.org, and check out all the episodes of all my podcast series. You can also find helpful maps and pictures, see my source lists, find some good books to read, and even buy Western Traditions merchandise on the shopping page. You may also contribute directly to the support of the podcast through the PayPal or Patreon options found there. Wherever you listen, on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcast, or on the website itself, remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment. The Apology is the second dialogue in the tetralogy of dialogues devoted to the trial and death of Socrates. For more information on tetralogies, see episode 29 in this Greek Sun series on my website, western-traditions.org. If you have read a little Plato already, then the format of the Apology may strike you as unexpected. Most of Plato's dialogues appear like play manuscripts to some extent, with the names of the various speakers noted in the margin of the text. The Apology is, however, for the most part, simply the text of the defense of Socrates at his trial, given in his own voice. The term apology here means just that, defense. So in the Roman Empire series, when we come to discuss Christian apologetics, we will be studying, therefore, the defense or explanation of Christianity. Plato's Apology is the courtroom defense or explanation of Socrates. He's not the only speaker, though, here. Very occasionally, and it's obvious when this happens, Meletus, the accuser of Socrates, will make a response to some prompt by Socrates. Anyway, the dialogue seems to begin after the prosecution's case has already been made against Socrates, so it starts with Socrates' apology or defense. And we should remember that Socrates' life is on the line here. This is a capital case. The penalty if found guilty is death. Socrates, as we find out in the course of the dialogue, has had the opportunity to plead guilty and accept banishment or some large fine as a penalty, but he has chosen instead to plead not guilty, as we would say today, and to speak his case before the 500. Now, Socrates, not surprisingly, being who he is, he begins his defense with some humor. Referring to those who have spoken against him in the trial, he says, "They almost made me forget who I was, so persuasively did they speak." But he continues that they have hardly spoken a word of truth. Socrates now addresses what he calls his quote-unquote first accusers who have pressed old charges against him, and he mentions how they told stories long ago about his investigations into the heavens above and his searches into the earth below. If you listen to the podcast on Aristophanes, then you already know how Socrates was portrayed as an eccentric character, proclaiming nonsense about the clouds and the sun and so on. Socrates refers here in the dialogue, basically, to the rumors that undermine his defense. These charges are not brought against him in court, but everyone has heard them, and they make his defense difficult. And this is something that all defense lawyers know today, that the past and public bad fame of a defendant can hurt his chances in court. And this is why they caution jurors against considering what they might already know about a defendant when they sit on a trial. Finally, though, setting aside the unofficial charges against him, Socrates sums up the actual charges that Meletus and the others have actually proposed, and he does so with the following words. Socrates is an evil doer who searches into things under the earth and in heaven, and he makes the worse appear the better cause, and he teaches these doctrines to others. And he name drops Aristophanes again here, recalling how the poet accused him of many investigations into such physical matters as the nature of heaven and earth. But Socrates protests, I have nothing to do with physical speculations, and this fits with what we learn about Socrates in Plato's dialogues. He is more a man in search of the truth regarding ethical matters, not physical matters. And now we come to the famous self-characterization of the man and the philosopher. Socrates agrees that he is a teacher, and he relates how that he has been called wise, and that he has always been in search of wisdom, the most important thing to possess. Furthermore, he tells the court about his friend Chaerephon, now dead, who in their youth together believed that Socrates was wise and even asked the oracle at Delphi about the matter. The oracle declared to his friend that there was no man wiser than Socrates. But there's a catch, and Socrates is not really tooting his own horn here, because as he relates in a long passage, wisdom only comes when a man knows, truly knows and understands that he knows nothing about anything. Socrates tells of how he went and observed men who were reputed to be wise. He was eager to learn from them, but after watching and thinking about their words and deeds, he found that these men seemed to be not very wise at all. He compares his efforts in this search for wisdom to the labors of Hercules, referencing the various feats of that hero in service to King Eurystheus. Socrates spoke with poets, with politicians, and with craftsmen, but among none of them did he find wisdom. Now, being Socrates, he could not help but tell each of these men that he did not think them wise, and so he made many enemies. Many of those men whom he told were not wise are probably now sitting in judgment over him. And then Socrates declares to the court, the truth is, O men of Athens, that only God is wise. And the meaning of the oracle, you might ask, when it said that there was no man wiser than Socrates? It merely meant that the wisdom of men is nothing, and that no one really knows anything, neither Socrates nor anyone else. Now, as you go on to read other dialogues of Plato, you will find that they frequently end with Socrates making a very similar conclusion. He will take a subject, perhaps some virtue such as justice or courage or temperance, and he begins to examine it with his friends in a discussion, and he nearly always comes to the same conclusion, that no one really knows the truth of the matter, that no one knows what is just, what is courageous, what is good. And perhaps this was more frustrating to his judges than anything else, and certainly it frustrates many a reader. After all, how many of us approach a text, religious or philosophical, hoping to find some kind of answer, some solution to a life problem, to a personal quandary? Many such sources exist in the world, books and advice columns and self-help websites that propound to have the solution for you, to provide a path to happiness and well-being. Socrates promises you no such thing. In his work, you find few, if any, answers, and generally just more questions. This refusal to make a declaration can frustrate many people who simply want a clear answer or direction, and doubtless many of Socrates' judges found this irritating quality of the man to be a sort of shove in the direction of condemnation, regardless of what they thought about his possible atheism. Worsening public opinion about Socrates, as he himself states, is that young men from the wealthy families have come to hear him, and now they go about questioning their elders about many different matters. And when their elders cannot answer these questions adequately, the young men are coming to the conclusion that their elders are not really any wiser than they themselves are. And this may be the real cause of distress and the anger and suspicion now directed at Socrates. If we can believe this recounting here in Plato's dialogue, Socrates appears to have riled up the younger generation of the ruling classes in Athens and to have upset their parents, who were the actual rulers. Perhaps the attempts to connect Socrates to the oligarchy of the past and to the ambitions of the late Alcibiades were really just a cover for this attempt to silence his dissent. Numerous times, here and elsewhere, Socrates refers to himself as a gadfly, a bothersome pest who won't let anyone in peace. What is interesting is that Socrates accomplishes all this upset in society not with an alternative point of view. He's not playing left wing against the right or right wing against the left, to use a modern political analogy, but rather Socrates is upsetting the status quo with a negative assertion that no one really knows anything about what is right or wrong, good or evil, not even about the gods, and he includes himself among the ignorant. The middle portion of the Apology contains some direct interaction between Meletus and Socrates. Our hero basically engages in a lot of sophistry about the meanings of terms, about first principles, which is his usual method of inquiry in the other dialogues. During this interchange, Meletus admits that he believes Socrates to be a complete atheist, not merely a preacher of other strange gods, but rather one who denies them all. And he also declares that Socrates has said that the sun and moon are not gods, but rather that the sun is a stone and the moon is made from earth. But Socrates also manages to undermine the first principles of every conceivable argument made against him. Finally, he vows that he will not stop his questioning, not stop his investigation into his favorite issues and matters, no matter what the penalty. Because, as he says, he will obey God rather than men, that it would be sinful for him to obey the court and cease speaking in public because it would be disobedient to God. During his long speech, Socrates makes an interesting reference to an inner voice, or oracle, as he calls it. The Apology is not the only place where he brings this up, this voice that he claims comes from inside and guides his decisions. He calls it a daemon, and we should not confuse this with the demons of Christian mythology, though the term is related. It's spelled or transliterated as Daemon, and it means a supernatural entity, somewhere between gods and men, not inherently evil, though I don't suppose a daemon would be prevented from being evil either. Think perhaps of the way that the Irish think of the fairies as semi-divine creatures that are neither allied with God nor Satan. Here, Socrates seems to mean, by daemon, he seems to mean an inner voice that guides his thinking, or at least influences it. A lot has been written and said about this inner voice of Socrates that he brings up, his daemon. It will come up again in other dialogues. And the question is he hearing voices, or is he just referring to his conscience, or his gut instinct, as we might say today? Socrates appears to think that this daemon, this inner voice, is always right, and his obedience to it certainly sounds a lot like Catholic doctrine on conscience, which says that you must always obey your conscience, no matter what the rules and the laws of the external world seem to suggest. Indeed, Socrates does seem to consider this matter religiously. He also goes on to say that he himself is in fact a gift from God, because he is teaching his fellow Athenians to seek the truth, to seek wisdom. But no matter which side of that matter that you come down on, you cannot deny the poignancy of Socrates' final statements to the court. He addresses the fear of death. He refuses to get into whether or not he fears death, but he does have this to say. He says that some men might, at this juncture, make a spectacle of themselves, cry and beg for mercy, or even perhaps present their children in court in order to provoke leniency among the judges. And here the text provides actually some interesting biographical data on Socrates. He reminds us that he has 3 children of himself, one of them almost a man now, but 2 still quite young. So Socrates apparently married late in life, because he is at this point, as he says, over 70 years old. But anyway, referring to other men who have been condemned to death under these circumstances, Socrates goes on. I have seen men of reputation, when they have been condemned, behaving very strangely, as if they believed that they were going to suffer horribly if they died, and that they might be immortal if only they might be allowed to live. But Socrates swears that he will do no such thing. In the following dialogue of Plato's, the Crito, Socrates will come back to his philosophy about death. Most importantly, Socrates says, the men of the court should never bend to such appeals to mercy. They should never make a gift of justice, he says. Rather, they should simply judge properly and carry out their verdicts. And this speaks a great deal to Socrates' views on the importance of the authority of the state, which again I will come to at the end of this episode. Now, the dialogue abruptly segues here without telling us how the court decided. Instead, Socrates simply carries on, and he appears from the dialogue, the text of it, to have already been told the verdict, as he makes reference to the vote of condemnation. He now ridicules the idea of pleading for alternate penalties, such as prison or exile. Why should I live in prison and be a slave to the judges, he says. And as for exile, he laughs at the idea that the men of another city should suffer his presence if his own countrymen could not tolerate him. And he reiterates that he could not under any circumstances cease from speaking with people about his ideas and making his queries. In other words, he can't make a deal which involves him shutting up. Examining myself and others is the greatest good of man, he says, and the unexamined life is not worth living. And that, dear listeners, is precisely the sentiment that spurred me to make this podcast, and maybe the reason that you listen to it or that you read Plato. That which makes us human, which may distinguish us from all the other creatures on this planet, is our capacity to examine ourselves, to think about our thoughts. Not merely to think. We know that there are other animals that think somehow, but to think about our thoughts, to question our preconceptions and biases, to seek the truth beneath the layers and the accretions of thousands of years of civilization, to peel them back and reveal the truth, capital T truth, the desire to bask in the glory of real knowledge. Dante Alighieri, in his Divine Comedy, leads the reader along a tortuous path from the darkness, the pain, and the lies of hell to the supreme glory of heaven, where he is briefly allowed to stand in the presence of that capital T truth. Surely, in that allegorical tale, the medieval Italian author was accomplishing what we only really ever dream about, but what we, like Socrates, always seek: to know the fundamental truth of things. This is the divinely inspired mission of Socrates, to seek the truth, to understand the meaning of human life, and to find the happiest way to preserve that life. Socrates, speaking about his guilty verdict and the coming death penalty, goes on. The difficulty, my friends, is not to avoid death, but to avoid unrighteousness. And the philosopher turns prophet here, standing on the edge of the abyss as he is. He refers to himself as an accuser, someone who has held his fellow men accountable for their words and actions. I quote him, "I prophesy to you who are my murderers, that you have killed me to escape an accuser. But there will be more accusers of you than there are now, and as they are younger, they will be more inconsiderate of you, and you will be more offended with them." In late antiquity and in the Middle Ages, some men of the Christian church saw in Socrates and his doctrines a precursor of Christ and the gospel. Socrates encourages men to seek truth and righteousness rather than wealth or earthly power, and he goes to his death rather than deny his divinely ordained mission. In my episode on Greek religion, I pointed out how ancient Greek spiritual practices were already quite similar to Christianity. And here with Socrates, we can see how many of the deeds and words of Socrates also resemble the theology of the early Christians, especially when you look at the early martyrs, such as Ignatius of Antioch, who gladly went to the lions rather than deny Christ, whom he considered to be the truth itself. There will be more on this topic in the third series when we come to the advent of Christianity in ancient Rome. Now, though, in the latter portion of the Apology, and in the Crito, the dialogue which follows, Socrates endeavors to explain why death should not be looked on as an evil, but rather it should be embraced. Those of us who think that death is an evil are in error. Thus says Socrates in the closing paragraphs of Plato's Apology. He approaches the topic in a frankly practical fashion, comparing the logical possibilities that might follow death: simple extinction or eternal life with the gods and heroes of the past. Quote, either death is a state of nothingness and utter unconsciousness, or there is a change and a migration of the soul from this world to another. And if in that other world a man might meet up with the great ones of the past, such as Orpheus and Homer and Odysseus, whom Socrates mentions among others there, and be able to speak with them about their deeds and their ideas, then what is to be worried about? Be of good cheer, he says, because no evil can happen to a good man, either in life or after death. In that other world, men do not put other men to death merely for asking questions. The text of the Apology ends with these words from Socrates: "The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways, I to die and you to live. Which is better, only God knows." But this examination of death has not come to an end, nor has Socrates' career. Some of his most important ideas are yet to be presented. The Crito is a short dialogue which follows the Apology. Socrates sits in prison and receives a visitor, Crito, whose name is given to the dialogue. Crito is a friend of Socrates. I pointedly say friend and not follower. Crito has grown up with Socrates, and he appears with him in more than one dialogue of Plato's, but he does not come off as very philosophically inclined. He seems more a genuine friend of Socrates, someone who simply cared about the man, and not someone who instead mooned over his ideas. Crito pleads with Socrates to escape. It doesn't even have to be dramatic or violent, this escape. Money is easily available, he says, to bribe the right people and arrange for him to leave the city. Indeed, you can even imagine that the authorities liked this possibility to be available to criminals, to avoid bloodshed and allow people to simply remove themselves from the vicinity, to ostracize themselves. After all, they had given him so many options before this: to choose exile, to choose a fine, to choose to simply shut up. And the prison in which Socrates sits does not sound like a heavily guarded place. Crito here also worries that not only will he lose a beloved friend if Socrates does not escape, but he also worries that, quote-unquote, the many will think ill of him if he allows his friend Socrates to die. The many. Not many people, but the many. This is the accepted translation of the ancient Greek phrase used here, hoi polloi. You may have heard it even used in English conversations sometimes as a reference to the riffraff, the common people, the lowest common denominator of society. When we come to the era of Christianity in the third series on Rome, this phrase will be used again in the New Testament, which was written in Greek, to refer to the masses of humanity, and it's also used in Latin translation in the Catholic Mass. Here and elsewhere, Socrates uses the phrase hoi polloi quite dismissively. He is referring to the crowd here, really, and the crowd is another phrase used in Platonic dialogue to refer to the mass of unthinking people who vacillate between ideas, who operate without thought, essentially. People who do not take the time to examine their lives, but just follow trends and think with the herd. This is the majority of humanity, really, the masses, which political tracts refer to, the humming multitude of humanity. In the New Testament, in the Gospel, the crowd is another phrase used. The crowd receives Jesus into Jerusalem and acclaims that he's the king, and a week later, it's the same word, the crowd, calls out for his execution. You see, Socrates doesn't give a hoot for hoi polloi, for the many, and he tells Crito this. But why, my dear Crito, should we care about the opinion of the many? Good men, the only persons who are worth considering, will think about these things truly as they occurred. But Crito points out that the many have the ability to do the greatest damage with their opinions, and in this age of cancel culture, we are probably inclined to agree with Crito. The seething, thoughtless horde of gossips can indeed do great damage. But not in Socrates' opinion. If only they were able to do the greatest evil, laments Socrates, then they would also be able to do the greatest good. But the reality is otherwise, he tells us. They can make a man neither wise nor foolish, and whatever they do is simply the result of chance. Now, Socrates makes a remarkable statement during his conversation with Crito. It's actually part part and parcel of his doctrine spread throughout Plato's dialogues, but if this is your first encounter with Socrates, the remark may surprise you. Here it is at length. Shall we insist on the truth of what was then said, that injustice is always an evil and dishonor to him who acts unjustly? Shall we say so or not? Yes, Crito agrees. Then we must do no wrong? Certainly not, Crito agrees. Nor, when injured, injure someone in return, as the many imagine, for we must injure no one at all. Clearly not, Crito responds. Again, Crito, may we do evil? Surely not, Socrates. And what of doing evil in return for evil, which is the morality of the many? Is that just or not? Not just, Crito says. For in doing evil to another is the same as injuring him? Very true, Crito agrees. Then, Socrates concludes, we ought not to retaliate or render evil for evil to anyone, whatever evil we may have suffered from them. Now, I will come back to this turn the other cheek doctrine in the episode's conclusion, but it's clear that there is an integrity to Socrates' creed. Just as he would do no wrong to another human being, he will also do no wrong to the state. The state is even more to be respected than man because it is the father and mother of man. And we will come to Socrates' belief about the value of the state in just a moment. Crito, though, still does not relent from pleading for Socrates to attempt to escape or otherwise survive this ordeal through trickery or bribery, but Socrates has made a decision, and in the remainder of this short dialogue, he makes a quintessential Socratic argument. Good men are to be regarded, and not the bad, he asks Crito, and Crito agrees. This assent of Crito's, as you heard before, it's repeated many times in the passages I've read and will continue to read, and it's a critical part of most Socratic dialogue, this assent. Socrates wants to convince you that you already believe what he propounds, and therefore, in the dialogues, he will ask his companions in conversation to agree or disagree at multiple points along the way, and if anyone dissents or disagrees at any point, the conversation must pause to work out the disagreement. He does not want to simply run roughshod over your own thoughts. Socrates seeks above all to harmonize your thoughts with his and his with yours. So he makes sure that at every juncture that everyone is in agreement before he proceeds. So he has established that only the thoughts and opinions of the good are to be considered. The opinions of the wise are good and the opinions of the unwise are evil, he asks. And Crito again agrees. And so Socrates goes on building his argument now upon this agreement. Socrates here studies the value of a good life rather than simply life. In other words, a noble and honorable life rather than a life of cooperation with injustice or with falsehood. It is not simply that Socrates is suicidal either. He states that he would escape if it were right to escape, but that in this case, it is the right thing to accept the decision of the state. And this is something that you must understand about Socrates, and which possibly few modern readers can really agree with him about, though they may think they are in agreement. Socrates is not a rebel in the classic sense. Socrates would never dream of disobeying the state, let alone overthrowing the state. Does he want the state to change somehow, some way? Certainly. But to undermine the state? Never. Socrates has a devotion to politics, an appreciation of authority that is important to grasp. Plato's longest Socratic dialogue is the Republic. He actually has a dialogue known as the Laws, but it's longer, but it does not feature Socrates. Anyway, the Republic is a dialogue entirely about how to form a proper state with a perfect government. Now, Socrates may very well not agree with some fundamental ideas on which the city of Athens presently operates. He does dream of that perfect republic. He dreams about that ideal republic in his dialogues, but he would never try to thwart the decrees of the government. Now, in the West today, we idolize rebels. The United States is founded on the idea of rebellion, of declaring independence, of altering or abolishing a government if we deem it unjust according to some pseudo-divine scheme, according to some nebulous divine rights. Socrates may or may not have thought that the British treatment of its North American colonies in the late 18th century was unjust, but I'm certain that he would never have cooperated with the revolution, even though some of the men who accomplished it were great admirers of his. Nor would he have cooperated with many of the other revolutions that have plagued the West in the last few centuries, the English Civil War, the Restoration, the French Revolution, and so on. Socrates understands that unless people accept with equanimity both the good things that the state gives us, such as security, marriage, architecture, water supplies, religious festivals, and so on, as well as the quote-unquote bad things, such as taxes, punishment, etc., then there will never be any peace among men. Better a bad government than no government, Socrates would probably think. And no government is what a man creates when he decides to rebel against the rules, the laws, just or unjust, fair or unfair, laid down by the state over him. And thus he characterizes his possible rebellion in these dialogues, his possible escape. He personifies the state in his speech, and he imagines how it might speak to him if he tried to subvert the verdict of the judges. I quote him here. Are you not going to overthrow us, the laws, and the whole state? Do you imagine that a state can subsist in which the decisions of law have no power, but can be set aside and trampled on by individuals? Socrates here imagines himself whining in response, but the state has injured us and given us an unjust sentence. And was that our agreement with you? He portrays the state responding. Or were you expected to abide by the sentence of the state? Did we not bring you into existence? Your father married your mother through our aid and begat you. And he goes on to delineate how the state brings its citizens into existence and then nurtures them and provides for their education. And then the state has this to say. Since you were brought into the world and nurtured and educated by us, can you deny in the first place that you are our child and slave, as your fathers were before you? And if this is true, are you not on equal terms with us? Nor can you think that you have a right to do to us what we are doing to you. Would you have the right to strike or revile or do any other evil thing to your father or your master if you had one, because you had been struck or reviled by him, or received some other evil at his hands? You would not say this, and because we think right to destroy you, do you think that you have any right to destroy us in return, and your country as far as in you lies? Will you, O professor of true virtue, pretend that you are justified in this? Has a philosopher like you failed to discover that our country is more to be valued and higher and holier, more than mother or father or any other ancestor, and more to be regarded in the eyes of the gods and of men's understanding, and also to be soothed and gently and reverently entreated when angry, even more than a father, and either to be persuaded, or if not persuaded, to be obeyed? And when we are punished by her, whether with imprisonment or stripes, the punishment is to be endured in silence. And if she leads us to wounds or death in battle, thither we follow as is right. Neither may one yield or retreat or leave his rank. But whether in battle or in a court of law or in any other place, he must do what his city and his country order him to do, or he must change their view of what is just. And if he may do no violence to his father or mother, much less may he do violence to his country. What answer shall we make to this, Crito? Do the laws speak truly, or do they not? I think that they do, Crito responds. There's a lot to reflect on here in Socrates' discourse. This statement he makes about not retreating in battle, of course, speaks to his own experiences. He is famous for not retreating at a particular battle in the Peloponnesian War. But I really have to say that first, Socrates' view of the state here, it reminds me in its tone a lot of the book of Job in the Bible. After Job suffers horribly throughout the book, he loses his wealth, his family, he even loses the integrity of his body. The Lord manifests himself in storm clouds, and in response to Job's complaints, he does not really answer him. God only asks him questions in return, such as, where were you when I formed the world, when I lifted up the mountains and spread out the vast seas, and so on. The state in this Socratic dialogue comes off similarly divine here in Socrates' personification. I brought you into existence, the state says. I was here before you. Who are you to question my works? This is a tough pill for most Westerners to swallow, I think. I think that a lot of us may feel this way, like everyone should obey the law no matter how we feel about it sometimes when our political party or our candidate is in power, of course. But as soon as we are out of power, it's suddenly all about our natural rights and the duty to resist injustice and so on. Socrates is determined, though, to preserve his integrity. He has hailed and lauded the authority of the state, and he is not going to die inconsistent with himself. He's not going to live out the last few years of his life as a living contradiction to virtually his entire body of work and thought. Furthermore, Socrates, who is often imagined by those who have learned only a little about him as a sort of freewheeling ancient hippie with a lot of left-wing ideas, he really reveals himself to be unbelievably conservative, although that's not really the right word, but he is adamant about obedience to the state in a way which I think many Westerners, particularly Americans, could not agree. He sees the state as divine, and really he's not unusual in this. In American parlance, yes, this is strange, but what Americans often misunderstand about the politics of foreigners, even when those foreigners are allies, is this historic association of the state with divinity. This is something that I get into more in the episodes of various other series, the way that politics and religion, which Americans insist on trying to separate, have actually always been quite close, if not identical, in history. For more information on this, look up some of the countries in Europe which Americans might consider to be very, quote, liberal or left-wing or free-thinking, such as Sweden, and see how many of these countries have state-supported churches, churches which are funded by tax money. This can be quite the eye-opener for Americans. Now, here is how Socrates closes this line of thinking as Crito listens and reluctantly assents to his friend's conclusions. You, Socrates, are breaking the covenants and agreements which you have made with us at your leisure, not in any haste or under any compulsion or deception, but after you have had 70 years to think of them, during which time you were at liberty to leave the city, if we were not to mind, or if our covenants appeared to you to be unfair. You had your choice, and might have gone either to Lacedaemon or Crete, both of which states are often praised by you for their good government, or to some other Hellenic or foreign state, whereas you, above all other Athenians, seem to be so fond of this state, or in other words, of us her laws, and who would care about a state which has no laws, that you never stirred out of her. The halt, the blind, the maimed were not more stationary in her than you were. And now you run away and forsake your agreements. Not so, Socrates. If you will take our advice, do not make yourself ridiculous by escaping out of the city. Listen then, Socrates, to us who have brought you up. Think not of life and children first, and of justice afterwards, but of justice first, that you may be justified before the princes of the world below. For neither will you nor any that belong to you be happier or holier or juster in this life, or happier in another, if you do as Crito bids you. Now depart you in innocence, as a sufferer and not a doer of evil, a victim not of the laws, but of men. But if you go forth, returning evil for evil and injury for injury, breaking the covenants and agreements which you have made with us, and wronging those whom you least ought to wrong, that is to say yourself, your friends, your country, and us, we shall be angry with you while you live, and our brethren, the laws in the world below, will receive you as an enemy, for they will know that you have done your best to destroy us. Listen then to us, and not to Crito. This, dear Crito, is the voice which I seem to hear murmuring in my ears, Socrates goes on, like the sound of the flute in the ears of the mystic. That voice, I say, is humming in my ears, and it prevents me from hearing any other. And I know that anything more which you may say will be in vain. Yet speak, if you have anything to say. I have nothing to say, Socrates. Leave me then, Crito, to fulfill the will of God, and to follow whither he leads. Imagine, if you will, how the story of Christ would have impacted the Greeks 2,000 years ago. when they had by then idolized Socrates and spread his ideas around the Greco-Roman world. Here we have a hero who is a victim of a state which has unjustly condemned him. He preaches that we should do no injury to others, not even when injured by them, to turn the other cheek, so to speak, who lived in poverty rather than seek wealth in exchange for his teachings, who values truth and justice over life, who suffers and dies for his message, who believes that God compels him to both seek the truth but also obey the earthly laws that condemn him for this seeking. Am I speaking about Christ here or about Socrates? The similarities will continue to appear as we enter the next and final stage of Socrates' journey. The Phaedo is a long dialogue of Plato's which focuses on the last day of Socrates' life in prison, and it ends with his death by poison. Until that next episode, then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.